Here we are, and we are live, talking to the Sigmund Freud group. Feel free to join in, or feel free to just watch. Either way, uh, you're welcome. Today, I'm going to talk about hysteria, the Freudian concept of hysteria. And I think I'm just going to start by reading the Defense Neuropsychoses, which is in this big American collected works set, and it's one of the first papers in Freud's kind of collected essays. So, like I said, feel free to join. I'm probably going to comment throughout. Certainly, if people want to join, they're welcome to come and comment with me. And if you want to follow along, the paper is The Defense of Neuropsychoses with a dash, right? So, okay. This is kind of fun because Freud has this concept of hysteria, which he describes as an endeavor to provide a psychological theory of acquired hysteria, many phobias and obsessions, and certain hallucinatory psychoses. So everything from anxiety to hallucinating to obsessional compulsive, he has this sort of unified theory. So I'm going to be going through it. And feel free to click that StreamYard link and you can join in a talk, or if you could watch as well and listen. So I'm going to start going through this from The Defense of Neuropsychoses. After a close study of several patients suffering from phobias and obsessions, a tentative explanation of these symptoms forced itself upon me, and as it later enabled me to successfully to divine the origin of similar pathological ideas in other cases, I consider it worthy of publication and of further tests. Along with this psychological theory of phobias and obsessions, observation of these patients has resulted in a contribution to the theory of hysteria. So before I go on, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so you get the general idea of what we're doing, which is here. So I'm going to sum this all up a little bit. These patients whom I analyzed had enjoyed good mental health up to the time at which an intolerable idea presented itself within the content of their ideational life. That is to say, until their ego was confronted by an experience, an idea, a feeling arousing an effect so painful that the person resolved to forget it. So this is like the core Freudian idea. We have the DSM, which is a very like kind of Kantian kind of thing, which puts everybody into different sort of psychopathological categories. But Freud is talking about something different. So why do we have a Freud group, right? Why have a Freud group if we have the DSM? And once again, to reiterate, this is why we have a Freud group rather than a general psychology group. These patients, whom I analyzed, had enjoyed good mental health up to the time at which an intolerable idea presented itself within the content of their ideational life, right? So that means you're going along and suddenly you have an idea of your life. So what a sort of cognitive approach would be is to match up everything to this ideational world and to kind of make you follow through on your goals. But Freud is definitely of this kind of splinter. The attention is to the splinter in the ideational life and your reaction to it. So it's kind of like a meta psychology. So you could look at modern psychology as kind of a very straightforward, goal-oriented, conscious pursuit. But Freud wants you to challenge your relationship to these kinds of splinters which are occurring, right? So it'll just be, it's just very different. So I'll keep going from this part. Since he had no confidence in his power to resolve the incompatibility between the unbearable idea and his ego by process of thought. So you try to think your way out of the splinter in terms of you're trying to desperately match the idea. So we have the idea of hysteria, which is you have your sense of self, you have your ego, right? And hysteria is this process of trying to match all these thoughts into this kind of grand algorithm or narrative without dealing with what happens when the splinter comes in. You can talk about this kind of splinter in various ways, and if you'll notice kind of modern theory like Hegel or Lacan, they're very much of these kinds of schisms, right? Why do they talk about the schisms, and what does Freud have to do with schisms? Well, this is it. In 1894, Freud is starting to write about this process of ideas which are incompatible being repressed. That's kind of like the essential Freudian notion. A lot of people will talk about Oedipus as the essential Freudian notion, or sex or death drive as the essential Freudian notion. But really, it's kind of this idea that things which are incompatible kind of come up to this narrative, this ego narrative, and then a symptom is formed, right? Facebook user, splinter, schism, or castration. Yeah, so this can happen in various ways, right? So castration is the process. You make a demand, or you make a sort of you have your grand narrative, you have your idea, and then something stops you, right? So much like kind of the Freudian idea is the relation to the splinter of this ego ideal. Castration is also, what do you do when you hit this kind of frustrated point? When you hit this kind of pause. And a lot of what happens is a result of a hysteric response to this is to deny that this has happened, right? So say I want to kind of, I don't know, pursue a goal, and then I'm unable to do it very concretely. Then there's this sort of figure of the superpotent father that emerges, right? And that's kind of the Zizekian interpretation of Lacan, which is the superpotent father then emerges as the person who is uncastratable, the one who is able to sort of get everything that comes to his command. So yeah, castration is part of this hysterical response mechanism. Ideals. It's interesting because a lot of times what happened before Freud was there was this idea of degeneracy, right? So it seems like hysteria is a pretty bad idea. Like hysteria is like, are you saying that women are unable to control their minds and thus become hysterical? But before hysteria, there was a worse one. And I would argue hysteria isn't that bad, although the cultural symbolic of hysteria is obviously bad in terms of discounting people on the basis of whatever hysterical response purely. But before that was the degeneracy theory. So the degeneracy theory, if we read the degeneracy theory through Freud, right, is that your ideals themselves are kind of bad, right? So but it really, of course, this is just the process of repression and neuroses, which is, okay, somebody doesn't have good enough ideals, so they become mad, they become insane. So hysteria is actually a move away from this kind of societal construct, right? Which basically posits the doctor's ability to know kind of good moral thought and to match their patients to it. So now we're going and we're actually talking to people, and we're actually trying to figure out what's happening. So, okay, why don't we read a little bit more Freud? And if you have questions or if you want to join, although I know it's kind of, I'm not very good at planning. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I kind of feel like doing this. So people can jump in, but that's not really how it works when you have to plan other people. So feel free to just watch as you're doing or comment or something like that. So, okay. Thus, we can see that the characteristic factor in hysteria is not to be found in the splitting of consciousness, but that in the capacity for conversion. And we may assume that the psychophysical capacity to transmute such large quantities of excitation into somatic innervation is an important element of the disposition to hysteria, which in other respects is still unknown. So hysteria is also kind of this repression process happens, the schism happens, and then what happens as a result is you don't recognize that there's a schism, but rather it becomes a logic emerges from it, right? Which is a pathological logic. Okay. This capacity does not in itself preclude mental health and leads to hysteria only where there is some mental incompatibility or an accumulation of excitation. With this new turn in the theory, Breuer and I approach Oppenheim and Strumpel's well-known definition of hysteria and recede from Janet, who assigns too great importance to the splitting of consciousness as a characteristic of hysteria. So the idea is, oh, you don't have a singular mind, right? But it's actually this process of repression and reemergence, right? The presentation here given may claim to have rendered the relation between conversion and the hysterical splitting of consciousness intelligible. So this is his next part. So now that he's outlined hysteria as this repression, convergence process, right? He says, if the capacity for conversion does not exist in a person predisposed to hysteria, and yet the separation of its affect from an unbearable idea is nevertheless undertaken as a defense against the latter, then this affect must persist in the psychical sphere. Thus weakened, the idea remains present in consciousness, detached from all associations, but its affect, now freed from it, attaches itself to other ideas, which are not in themselves unbearable, but which, through this false connection, grow to be obsessions. This is shortly the psychological theory of obsessions and phobias, which I mentioned to start with. So then, what does the obsessional, right? Why does the obsessional care about this? Because there's an element related to the symptom. But it's also, this is where my kind of notion of self-interest, I think, comes up, not to say Freud isn't the master here, but in terms of my personal reflection on kind of Freud's idea of obsessions is, well, there is an ideological conversion, but then what do we make of that end product, right? What do we make of the end product? Why is the end product invalid? And then my posit would be that this end product isn't invalid unless it's experienced by the patient as this sort of thing, because there's no sort of end within. You kind of take the unconscious and bring it forward, and then what you're bringing forward is kind of a cascade of negative ideas or ideas which are schisms, right? There's no kind of logical reason that psychological health should be this process of bringing forward the repressed content. But insofar as obsessions come in, when the obsession no longer provides enjoyment, or there's a kind of depression, right? And I've written a blog post about this, which is enjoyment out of order, which is, I wrote this like a year ago, but the idea is the obsessional kind of creates this battery of kind of signifiers and acts, right? And suddenly they can no longer get enjoyment out of it. And that's when the obsessional becomes, you could say, pathological and needs therapy, in their own opinion. Like I always put it back, I'm very client-centered in this manner. Like it's like when the obsessional finds that the obsession is no longer satiating, then they can come into therapy. So, okay. I'll now enumerate the various elements necessary to the structure of this theory that admit of direct proof, and then describe those that I have myself supplied. Apart from the final result of the process, that is obsession, it is possible in the first place to demonstrate the ultimate source of the affect, which is now falsely attached to some other idea. So Freud will bring up a lot more often that this obsession is false, right? That there's something false about it, which is, in a Lacanian sense, a very hysterical aspect to Freud. So Freud is very attuned to the origins of these obsessions. He doesn't really think about these obsessions as being good or bad on their own, but he's doing what Lacan calls the process of the creation of new knowledge, which is he's hysterically rejecting the obsession as true. The obsession for Freud is false, right? Which allows him to produce more knowledge. We could say that his own mood, it might give him certain pathologies, and which he could reflect on in his own therapy, which he refused to ever do, which is fairly based in my opinion, although not necessarily good. I do love the idea that Freud was like, I'm perfect. I don't need therapy. I'm Freud. Which is funny because he does have these hysterical mechanisms himself, obviously. So okay. In all the cases I have analyzed, it was in the sexual life that a painful affect of precisely the same quantity, the same quality as that's a Hegelian slip, not a Freudian slip. When you say quantity instead of quality, or the other way, the same quality as that attaching to the obsession had originated. On theoretical grounds, it is not impossible that this affect may at times arise in other spheres. I have merely to state that hitherto I have not discovered any other origin of it. Um, so the obsession, there's no other origin of the obsession besides the split. Uh, Outside, in terms of why does the obsession take the form that it takes? Why is it safe, right? So there are other causes, I would argue. Someone says from Facebook.com, oh, I've read this book. The study, insofar as it includes various cases, made the two voices very explicit, analyst and analyzand. But of talking of schism beyond hysteria and beyond reading it from an analyst perspective, there's also the opportunity to read it as a sort of dialectic in a very theatrical sense. It's like the script for a play. Sorry, kind of off topic. No, it's not off topic, but feel free to feel sorry. Thank you. Yeah. Feel free to add something positive and then feel sorry and then feel guilty about it. That's excellent. In Hysteria chat, that is exactly what you should be doing. Yeah. Yes. um, yeah. So okay. Yeah. Freud never takes himself to the level of Analysand, which is why he is the ultimate. You could say, as Zizek would say, the pervert master. He is never kind of in the patient mindset himself, although once in a while he'll kind of half pay tune to maybe he has his own psychological mechanisms, but it's very defined that there are neurotic individuals and normal individuals by Freud. Um, Absolutely. So, okay, continuing on the quest for the obsessional and why the symptom turns into obsession. Uh, Further, we have the most unequivocal utterances on the part of patients in the proof of the effort of will at the attempt at defense, upon which the theory lays emphasis, and in at least a number of cases, the patients themselves will inform us of the fact that the phobia or obsession first made its appearance after this effort of will had apparently succeeded in its aim. It almost seems like Freud is saying that people are doing it on purpose, but he is a bit split mind on this, whereas it's like, what is the level of purpose to these kinds of symptom formations? Ultimately, he tends to err on the side of you can't really say it's purposeful, right? When will you invite Dr. Bones again? When he comes out of hiding. I used to do a show with a man who was canceled named Dr. Bones. He is somewhere. I couldn't tell you where he is, my friend. All right. That's a whole nother thing. Yeah. R.I.P. Dr. Bones. He isn't dead, just offline. Okay. So like we were saying, uh, in at least a number of cases, the patients themselves will inform us of the fact that the phobia or obsession first made its appearance after this effort of will had apparently succeeded in its aim. Once something very disagreeable happened to me. This is him speaking of a patient. Once something very disagreeable happened to me. I did my utmost to thrust it out of my mind, to think no more about it. Finally, I succeeded. But then I got this, which since then I have never been rid of. With these words, a patient confirmed the chief points of the theory I have developed here. I love how Freud is also, the master also, he gets one example and it's confirmed. But okay, here we have a good example of what he's talking about, which is the process of how does repression, then conversion, or ideology, you can even say, and that's kind of the argument I make, not once again, not to undermine Freud the master, but the idea is that there's no real reason that this conversion is psychopathological until we examine the effects and kind of the outside integration of it, right? In terms of say you have a obsession for Scarlett Johansson, but instead of saying, "Oh, I'm just in love with Scarlett Johansson," you watch the Fantastic Four movie. Or is that Jessica Alba? I'm always mixing them up, but it still works. It still works, um, right? Uh, La femme n'existe pas. Example right there. It's the Scarlett Johansson, Jessica Alba synthesis. Uh, but yeah, so it's not just, it's like, what, should this person not watch the Fantastic Four movies or whatever, right? Um, but Freud's idea is that if you are a comic book obsessed person and it stems from this Scarlett Johansson obsession, then yes, it is false. You're living a lie. So okay. And you get the sense from comic book people. Sorry, that's like everybody here. But you get the sense from comic book people that there's something off. Could it be the sublimated? No. From a moment I was scared, but I turned to my mind something else. Since then, it hasn't troubled me. So one of Freud's early ideas is that the bringing into consciousness of these will produce a cure, and you will no longer be false. But there's a problem, which is truth doesn't necessarily mean happiness and lack of neuroses. Okay. In this frequent objection, we have proof that the obsession represents a substitute or surrogate for the unbearable sexual idea and has taken its place in consciousness. Between the patient's effort of will, which successfully represses the intolerable sexual idea, and the appearance of the obsessional idea, which through having little intensity in itself, is now endowed with incomprehensibly strong affect, there lies a gap which the theory here developed aims at filling in. So what is the problem with the obsession? It doesn't have the force that the truth has, and thus the obsession and depression go together because there's a kind of lack. It, it was Jessica Alba, Scarlett's too classy for the Fantastic Four. Yes. Okay. I don't know. Fantastic Four is pretty classy. No, no, maybe not. So, okay. The detachment of the sexual idea from its affect and its connection of the lateral with another idea suited to it but not intolerable are processes which occur outside consciousness. They may be presumed, but they cannot be proved by any clinical psychological analysis. So Freud actually, taking the lesson of all the Hegelians and Germans that are undoubtedly surrounding him, he's not German, he's Austrian, but still, the idea of the outside affecting consciousness is very popular in German philosophy and just general culture in the 19th century. Perhaps it would be more correct to say these processes are not of a psychical nature at all, but are physical processes, the psychical consequences of which are so represented as if what is expressed by the words detachment of the idea from its affect and false connection of the latter, detachment of the idea from its affect, right? This is a very popular notion in clinical psychology today, which is when one person is saying something, but they have a different kind of affect. So if somebody is saying, this is really sad, right? Which is very classic. You see that a lot in memes, right? The hysterical meme. So this is a very 1894 Freudian idea, which is currently, standard operating procedure, which is a split between affect and statement, depending on what you're talking about being seemingly in a different register. That split could be a sign of splitting, substitution, and thus the sort of depressive mood which comes in via this kind of falsehood, you could say. Or Freud would also say obsessions come in, but then what is the problem of obsessions? And eventually they don't produce enjoyment. They don't produce because they're false, right? They're elemental, fragmentary. Okay. Alongside the cases which show the unbearable sexual idea followed subsequently by the obsession, there is another series in which obsessions and painful sexual ideas are present simultaneously, We cannot very well call the latter sexual obsessions, for one essential feature of the obsessions is missing from them. They are fully justified, whereas the painfulness of the ordinary obsession constitutes a problem for both physician and patient. So far I have been able to see in cases of this kind, it appears that in them a perpetual defense is going on against sexual ideas continuously arising anew. That is, we are here concerned with an operation that has not yet been completed, so the obsession is an incomplete sexual operation. As long as they are conscious of the sexual origin of their obsessions, the patient often keep them concealed. When they complain about them, they as a rule express their astonishment that they are subject to the affect in question, that they feel anxious, or that they have such and such an impulse, and so on. To the experienced physician, this affect appears, on the contrary, to be justified and comprehensible. He only finds it surprising that an affect of that kind should be associated with an inappropriate idea. So here we have kind of society coming in, hurting, you could say psychological treatment. So we have another Facebook comment. So using this example, Scarlett's the obsession and Jessica Alba is the incomplete Scarlett. Uh, Thinky face. No. I think that's more of an example of me mixing up two, you could say actresses or something like that. With in my mind they register as maybe their signifiers or categories in my mind are so similar that I just interchange the two in my head. So yeah, let's see. That's clearly a psychopath. You could examine that maybe. Let's see. To the experienced physician, that affect appears, on the contrary, to be justified and comprehensible. He only finds it surprising that an affect of this kind should be associated with an inappropriate idea, right? So the idea is that a physician, to kind of clutch your pearls, you'll miss this kind of substitution for the sexual, right, into the kind of whatever the obsessional neuroses is. So if you operate on the cognitive level of, oh, well, I have this obsessional neuroses, but if only I could collect this and this stamp, then I would be happy, right? And the cognitivist might say, oh, well, how do you do that? How do you plan on doing that, right? But you're missing this kind of initial substitution and schism, right? Oh, Cooper Wilson is here. Cooper, hello.
Hey,
Are you,
can you hear me?
I can hear you. Would you like to participate? Or would you
I was
like?
just popping in to see what you were doing.
Oh yeah, well, welcome, Cooper. We're reading about Hysteria, the defense of neuropsychoses. Good to see you. You're in Oregon, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So Cooper, feel free if you want to weigh in at any point. We're talking about dislocated desire, mundane obsessions, and society which we live in. We live in a society, okay, and how that might harm the treatment. In terms of why is Freudian analysis so pushed to the side, and why is kind of cognitive therapy brought up, is because I would say cognitive therapy works with the obsessional logic of the obsession itself, right? But what we've covered so far is that hysteria produces a schism when one's self-identity or ego ideal, some content or an idea appears which is against the grain, right? So a very kind of simple mechanism. And then Freud's kind of next statement is, because Freud is a lot of times that this schism is sexual in nature. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And feel free to jump in at any time, because I'm basically reading like a sentence or two and then I'm commenting a little bit. Yeah. The affect of the obsession appears to him, in other words, to be dislocated or transposed. And if he is proceeding on the assumptions here laid down, he can, in a great number of cases, attempt its retranslation into the sexual. So Freud is very much of the idea that the cure is taking sort of what is repressed, right, and then and kind of my issue with that is you really have to see what is the obsessional content, because it's not necessary. I don't think life is necessarily a series of retranslations or conversions into original sexual material. That's why this process of psychotherapy is so individualized, right? Seeing what works for this person, this person, this person.
Each has
Um,
their own unique history.
yeah, because if society is in fact a sublimated a series of sexual impulses or something like that, or death drive impulses. The idea that society is totally eliminated, although that sounds very edgy, it doesn't really seem to strike true to me, right? So you have this kind of series of obsessional displacements, and part of it is ideological frameworks is kind of a conversion, is why does something appear from this negative content, which could be sexuality or just an incompatible idea, into the positive content of what is the societal construct, right? And we could say, clearly there is a sort of construct happening, but what is this role? And is it satiating whatever the initial kind of desires, which are unconscious or kind of incompatible with society, or incompatible, you could even say, with discourse, right? Um, Insofar as speaking is a kind of discourse. Um, Obviously, there are different discourses, right? There's mod chats. For instance, Cooper, moderator, welcome. Long time listener, first time caller. You look like V from V for Vendetta, which is very epic.
Oh,
Yeah.
I've got an action figure of him somewhere around here.
Very cool. Um, we have a comment. Is it sexual because of the sexual difference? Yeah, you could say that that contributes to it. I mean, the idea of sexual difference is definitely of the sexual. Um, I think sexual difference is an ego category to somewhat as well. Although maybe
When
look, yeah,
I'd
go
say
on.
when Freud uses the term sexual, it's usually just it's eros. It's the principle of union, um,
Hmm. Yeah, so the
coupling, or
actual difference to a certain, the idea that the man and woman contain sexual difference in positionality, where the woman embodies jouissance and the man holds jouissance, or holds the phallus or whatever, the access
Mhm.
to jouissance, kind of different sexual difference. I mean, that plays a role in eros, right? And then how does, the sexual, or like you said, the unity idea between these kind of two different positionalities, in a sense, are doomed to fail because they're different. They are, and
Mhm.
assuming they're accurate. Um, but there's tons of things which are actual difference, um, which then plays into this. Aren't all the analyses in the book female? I don't recall for sure. I don't think that's the case. I think um, there are famous, maybe in this book, I'm not sure, but there are famous male cases as well, which have been critiqued, like the Rat Man and so on. So, all right, to back to Hysteria book, the defense of neuropsychoses. So let's go to this. The ego gains considerably less advantage by choosing the method of transposition of affect as a measure of defense than it does by the hysterical conversion of psychical excitation into somatic innervation. Hmm. I skipped a paragraph. Let's go read that paragraph and find out what
Uh,
Freud's talking about here. Any idea which is either suited by nature to be associated with an affect of this quality, which is dislocated or transposed, uh, or else bears a certain relation to the unbearable idea in consequence of which it appears practicable to employ it as a surrogate for the latter, may be made use of in secondary connection with the detached affect. Thus, for example, an unattached anxiety, the sexual origin of which the patient is unable to recall, will seize upon the common primary phobias of mankind in regards to animals, thunderstorms, darkness, and the like, upon things which are manifestly associated with the sexual in some way or the other, such as urination, defecation, defilement, or contagion generally. So Freud here is positing the unconscious, right? Where before in the kind of beginning he sort of says something a little different. he sort of gives the seeds to contradict himself in terms of, he says, well, there's an incompatible idea within ego. So people say, yeah, there's lots of incompatible ideas. But then here he's saying, and that incompatible idea is sexual transpose, which is kind of singular thing, right? And then he kind of goes into the different signifiers of sexuality, which could reemerge, but they could simply just be incompatible ideas. Yeah, so then he says the ego gains considerably less advantage by choosing the method of transposition of affect as a measure of defense than it does by the hysterical conversion of psychical excitation into somatic innervation. So the psychotic who then converts things into maybe a hysterical response or a bodily response, right? Apparently you get more through that sort of hysteria than you do through the simple obsessional neuroses. I guess he means more. By more, he must mean a kind of Dionysian more, right? I think Freud is kind of laden with these value kind of judgments in terms of you get more satisfaction, which is, you could say, the sexual satisfaction through the somatic hysteria versus the displacement of the obsessional. The affect which the ego had to endure remains unchanged and undiminished, just as before, the only difference being that the unbearable idea is suppressed and cut off from recollection. Repressed. In other words, the repressed ideas then form again the nucleus of a second psychical group, which, as it seems to me, is accessible even without the aid of hypnosis. If in phobias and obsessions, the striking symptoms which in hysteria accompany the formation of independent psychical group fail to appear, this is probably because in the former the whole transformation takes place within the psychical sphere. The relation between psychical excitation and somatic innervation has undergone no change. To illustrate what has been said, since it's very opaque, so, I think that's 1894 for, that was a lot of words, right? To illustrate what has been said concerning obsessions, I'll give a few examples which are probably typical. They're probably typical. A young girl suffered from obsessive reproaches. If she read in the papers about counterfeiting coinage, the thought occurred to her that she had also forged coins. If an unknown criminal had committed a murder, she asked herself anxiously whether she had not done the deed. Oh, this is such a classic. And as a therapist, this is one I see a lot. And it's not generally in the general population so much. I think sometimes there might be an inkling of, you could say, reverse narcissism is what one client said to me. It's this tendency when bad things around you happen, you think you did it, right? So you see a bad thing and then it's, it was me, right? You immediately associate it to yourself. At the same time, she was quite conscious of the absurdity of these obsessive reproaches. So part of her recognition, she said, but she deeply feels, guilty. The sense of guilt gained for a time such an influence over her that her critical faculty was stifled, so that she accused herself to her relations and her physician of having really committed all of these crimes. Psychosis through simple intensification, overwhelming psychoses, and overwhelming psychoses. Hi, Elliot, says Facebook user. Hi, Facebook user. Yeah, so then in terms of the realm of psychoses, which is kind of a very, you could say, a terrifying realm, there is often this kind of totalizing thought of guilt, right? Which is, you'll also get things such as, you'll hear like people will read your mind. You'll get patients that think they're implanted and they're having their mind read, and it's this kind of process. It's Pierre. Bonsoir? Bonsoir? No, that's goodbye. I don't speak French, Pierre, but hello, Pierre. Good to have you. Good to have you. I don't know how to say hello in French. Do you know how to say
Bonjour.
bonjour? Of course it's bonjour. Interesting. Bonjour, Pierre. Bonjour. The sense of guilt gained for a time such an influence over her that her critical faculty was stifled, so that she accused herself to the relations of her physician having really committed all these crimes. Psychosis through simple intensification, overwhelming psychosis. And there's a long German word, Überwältigung Psychosis? Maybe. A close examination then revealed the source in which her sense of guilt arose. Accidentally stimulated by a voluptuous sensation, she had allowed herself to be led astray by a friend into masturbation and had practiced it for years. Terrible. She'd practice. So this is why people get upset at Freud, right? Yes, all this good stuff. Yes, okay. So I'm following you. Freud, neuroses, the unacceptable idea. Okay, sexual in origin, and then aha, she has been masturbating. This act has been producing her neuroses. So okay, you get, and a lot of times what critiques of Freud, they'll grab onto that, and they'll kind of miss the kind of foundational psychological principle. Ernesto
Well, it's
Vargas,
just
on
it
your go on.
it would be a mistake to say that the masturbation is causing her symptoms. It's part of the symptom,
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point as well, which is it could be the masturbation could be a reflection of a symptom or something like that. So it's not
Or
even,
it
yeah,
could be rooted in something even earlier, before her friend taught her or whatever, that could have just been a repetition of a previous event, quote event, you know.
yeah, that's true in terms of repressed content. Um, yeah, I think it's easy, and thank you, Cooper, for grounding me,
Yeah.
which is that to just dismiss this as Freudian nonsense in terms of masturbation is bad and that's, intrinsically pathological. But you make a good point in terms of this is, it could be in fact a symptom, another reflection, another somatization, you could say, of something else. Certainly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but the structure is there that you can diagnose the general outline of the symptom regardless of having access to that early history or what the patient can remember,
Yeah.
whether they're even telling the truth. The structure will still appear in their language and discourse.
Yeah. Well, the way I always, yeah, it's kind of circle, you kind of put together the pieces. What are all the pieces kind of circling, right? So, okay. An excessive indulgence after attending the ball had evoked the intensification leading to psychoses. After a few months of treatment and close watching, the patient was cured. So it sounds like they did an anti-masturbation
Right.
observation. Now they do that. They still do that for women, but for eating disorders.
Hmm.
The intense watching is like, don't throw up. Don't knock that off your plate.
Yeah.
Right? Is that Wendy? Hello,
Yeah,
Wendy.
he
Wendy,
says hi.
two legends. Cooper is not a little white dog, although that was your avatar for many years. Is that still your avatar? I
No,
always knew you as the little white dog.
I've got him here.
There he is. There, incredible. I thought that was you for many years. Crazy how internet do that. Shall we go to one more example patient and we could talk about this this other this other example patient because this is a very long essay. So maybe we'll read one more to keep it relatively short, maybe like an hour.
Hmm.
So all right. A young woman who in 5 years of married life had only one child complained to me of an obsessive impulse to throw herself from the window or balcony, and also the fear of stabbing her child, which seized her at the sight of a sharp knife. Interesting. She confessed that marital relations seldom occurred and only with precautions against conception, but she added this was no privation to her as she was not of a sensual nature. I ventured to tell her that at the sight of a man she had erotic ideas, and that she had therefore lost confidence in herself and regarded herself as a depraved person capable of anything. So once again, the sexual becoming repressed once again, and then and in that manner you get the obsessional psychoses, which is the everything is my everything bad that happens is because of me, right? The retranslation of the obsession into the sexual was successful. In tears, she confessed that once to her long concealed misery in her marriage, and later on related in additional some painful thoughts of an unchanged sexual nature, such as the often recurring sensation of something forcing itself under her skirts. I have turned experiences of this kind to therapeutic advantage by redirecting the attention of patients with phobias and obsessions, in spite of all their protestations, back to the repressed sexual ideas, and where feasible, in blocking the source whence they arose. I naturally cannot assert that all phobias and obsessions arise in the manner here described, for first, my experience of them embraces only a limited number as compared with the relative frequency of these neuroses. And secondly, I myself know that these psychesthetic symptoms, as Janet terms them, are not all to be estimated alike. There are, for example, pure hysterical phobias. I believe, however, that the mechanism of transposition of affect will be found to exist in the great majority of phobias and obsessions. So the transposition of affect. Oh man.
Yeah,
So okay.
I think the main thing he's talking about there is the superego disallows things, or certain things are so forbidden that you can't even know what they are. And so you need a sort of metaphorical forbidden thing to displace to mask the actual thing you're not supposed to know.
Yeah. So okay. So at what point does, in terms of the sexual, turn into the psychotic or the obsessional, right? And what's the role of sublimation in that, in terms of even participating in society? Should we participate in society? And I think something to keep in mind is that there's a variety. There's like a multiplicity. That's a bad word. Bad Lacan word. Multiplicity. Like you. Excuse me. There's a multiplicity of ideas of sublimation.
Are you basically, you're questioning what the role of psychoanalysts should be?
Well, yeah.
Or
I think, well, not that what the role of psychoanalyst should be, but but more the question of what's the role of in terms of the relation to our ideological formations, right? So if we can say society is kind of an ideological form, symbolic, to what extent do we pay heed to these splinters in the symbolic? What do we make of these kinds of things which are not egosyntonic, right? Or as I put it, no, I shouldn't. No, really. So Freud's the guy. This is my obsession, which is like every time I have a narcissistic impulse, I say Freud's the guy. Relax. But in terms of that, there's a sort of conversion from these unconscious wills or these splinters into something else, and it's not necessarily psychopathological. This conversion into society, right? And this kind of layer isn't necessarily the truth. I don't know what you think of this sort of thing, or what your kind of take on this, or what I'm saying is. You haven't?
I don't think I have an opinion on it yet. I would need to read more.
Well, fair enough. So yeah, I think that's the main question of, modern psychoanalysis, or Zizek specifically's take on Lacan, which is of ideology. Kind of what is, if you take Zizek and bring Zizek back to Freud a little bit, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the process of when you do like integrate these kinds of theory ideas into therapy, which is what is the role, what is the exact mechanism of ideology, right? And you can say that kind of sexual, you can even say the obsession is an ideological construct, right? That they say if there's a sexual desire that gets turned into an obsession, that this obsession, Freud just calls it false, but I think Zizek would call it ideology, or at least they'd
I
recognize that there's a gap.
I would probably
Yeah,
lean towards the notion that most of our ideology is determined or shaped by the symbolic.
sure.
Um,
Can you explain a little more about that?
um, well, there's just signifiers that we pick up on that have seemingly universal import.
Yeah.
They're just applicable in all these different situations, like memes. Um, and the symbolic is how we exchange in society. We exchange meaning. Um, it's erotic to a certain degree. It's a sublimated sexual joining when you are discoursing with someone and you're using like terms. You're using the symbolic register to, I don't know what to call it exactly, but
Well, to
it's
join, to create the
to,
unity, right? The eros,
right.
as you said.
Hmm.
But for me, there's a question, and kind of Otto Bronk's, his critique of Freud, which I think is actually like a good explanation of Freud. He would say Freud's love therapy, because Ronk did will therapy. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, Ernesto says to fuck. Thank you, Ernesto. To fuck. But in terms of like eros, in terms of the unity, is a kind of love formation. The arrow, there's a, or at least an attachment, is what I would think modern psychodynamic psychology would call it, right? Which is there's an attachment or there's a unity feeling, which can take
Hmm.
the form of the erotic, certainly, but it's more. There is this creation of attachment when people do join together. But
But I
like you
do want
said,
to point out,
through the symbolic, yeah, go on.
I want to elaborate on that and say that that's what's happening for subjects. We feel a union or a connection with other people when we engage in the symbolic together.
Mm,
But what's going on in the unconscious isn't necessarily anything to do with the subject or the conscious ego part, what you're aware of. But in the unconscious, there is another element, um, which is death-like. Um, it's not about union or connection or attachment. It's a
yeah.
detached, affectless um, mortification, symbolic mortification. Um, it's there's always that aspect in the symbolic. It's always going to mortify or freeze certain things against our will. I mean, it's going to be something that is going to impose itself as a law on us. So um, to follow the law and to enter into the symbolic and become a subject is simultaneously to have an attachment with others, but it's also to have a permanent distance from them as well, because there's always this middle term sort of lodged in between you and the other person. It's what facilitates connection, but it's also what separates you.
Yeah. Well, there's the
So
unbridgeable gap, which is the symbolic. It was stuck
yes.
through the symbolic.
So
Yeah.
I don't know
And then
how I'm not
yeah.
sure how to connect that to Zizek's take on ideology, but that's how I see the symbolic. And when people are
Well,
talking about,
Zizek, yeah, Zizek likes to end on the gap, which is something I don't like to
mhm,
do. As somebody who you could say is a sophist or paid philosopher for a reason, or a therapist. A therapist wants to help somebody, right? Uh, feel a certain thing, but Zizek he has no motivation to do such a thing. Why? He doesn't need to do that, right? Um,
He wants to
the
problematize things and
yeah, exactly,
open up questioning and create,
exactly, which he does.
hysteric responses and yeah.
Sure, sure. But I think you make a good point in terms of bringing in the death drive a little bit, which you did very briefly, which is
Yeah.
there's this urge to come together and there's this urge to break apart, right? You could say it's like a sort of there's a sort of simple relation to unity and disunity in terms of these kind of have a sort of logic to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or as Moby says, people they come together, people they fall apart. Nothing can stop us now. We are all made of stars. That might be sublimated. That's the ideology. That's the plus. Isn't it all plus plus? Says Facebook.
Yeah. So I guess that's how I would connect it is
Yeah.
you have Eros and Thanatos, you have, love, you have death, but what happens, I guess, after you've acknowledged those two sides is that it gets sort of covered over or reappropriated, not by a subject, but by something, some outside. It takes it and plays with it. And it's not just a simple binary. We've seen how they correspond to each other and rely on each other. But that reliance is sort of superseded by what Zizek seems to be calling ideology.
Yeah.
Something that just goes on without any kind of prior. It's just sort of self
Sure.
justifying.
Yeah. Well, it's also outside the person's control, right? Is like one of Zizek's main points,
Yeah.
which is ideology is like is kind of like the air you breathe and forms your desires,
Yeah.
right?
I know what I have to
And
do, but I do it
how to enjoy.
nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. What, in terms of what do you desire? Like ideology forms are, you could say a general ideology, which is, I forget, where did I read this? Oh yeah, I read this in my old, this is in my old psych notes from my master's when I was a student, which was there's a kind of ideology of in my child and adolescent development class, which is there's something that kind of is against attachment in terms of the narrative, the ideological narrative of growing up and then leaving home, which
Mm-hmm.
is you could say is formally against growing up and staying at home, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's this, but yeah, so if there's this process of unity, but ideology tells us to desire disunity at that point, right? There is also like a need for a certain individuation, you could say, in general, which is the ability to disunite or break apart, right?
Yeah.
But then there's also, you could say, ideological constructs of unity and ideological constructs of disunity, which maybe we could talk about next time as well. Ideology is aesthetic, disjointivity. I see what, get it? Because it's broken. He wrote with periods. Oh wait, just. I read that as unity again.
Just
Unity is also what's on Rick James's ring when he punches Charlie Murphy in the head and leaves it on his head. A great metaphor for the necessity to break apart. Rick James releasing the album Unity, punching Charlie Murphy in the head, leaving Unity stamped on his forehead. Exactly. Because he's united with Rick James, even if Rick James punches him in the head.
That's good.
Yeah. So, okay. Why don't we end there for the day? Like a proper session, 1 hour on Hysteria.
Proper. Yes.
Proper. Yeah. Proper Freud Group General. Cooper, thank you for signing on. Good to see you. Good to see that you
Yeah.
look like V. Yeah, we'll probably do more of these Hysteria chats, Hysteria Freud Group General chats, and yeah, feel free to sign on and join. And as always, good to see you. And I'm gonna
Cool.
end the broadcast at this moment, so you can